Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, why Mozambique's election protests have become a mass movement. More than 2 months after a disputed vote, Mozambique's new generation is trying to release the grip of the party that's held power since independence. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Thousands of people have taken to the streets of Mozambique on the southeastern coast of Africa for months now, despite a bloody government crackdown on post-election protests. My guest today has been watching since the protests erupted.
My name is Zenaida Machado. I'm a senior researcher working for the Africa Division of Human Rights Watch.
Zenaida, welcome. It is good to have you here on The Take. More than 2 months after Mozambicans went to the polls for a general election in October, an election that was immediately called into question by the opposition, protests are still rocking the country.
Crowds of opposition supporters marched in several neighbourhoods here in Maputo and in other cities. They say the recent presidential and parliamentary elections were rigged.
Why have they gone on for so long, and what have they been like?
I should note that the irregularities in the elections were noticed and recorded not only by the opposition, but also by the national election observers and the international election observers, including the African Union, for example, and the European Union. Why have the protests not stopped until now? Those protests began largely peacefully. The first protest took place on the 21st of October. That was 2 days after 2 officials of the opposition were shot dead on the streets of Maputo.
Gunmen opened fire on a car carrying a party official and the lawyer of opposition politician Venancio Mondlane. The UN and the European Union have condemned the killings. Police have promised to investigate.
People of all parts of the society, not just opposition sympathizers. So a lot of people decided to go out to the scene where the incident took place and protest. One of those people was the presidential candidate Venancio Mondlane. Security forces responded by using excessive force. They fired tear gas, they fired live bullets, and several people got injured, including journalists that were covering the event. And the presidential candidate Venancio Mondlane, while he was giving an interview. So that led people to believe that security forces were deployed to deliberately target Venancio during that process. And since that day, he hasn't been seen in the Mozambican territory. He says he was forced to abandon Mozambique for security reasons.
You mentioned the injuries, but I know that rights groups have also said at least 40 people were killed in those protests when police and security forces began using this excessive force. What do we know about that? Because I'd read that police have launched an investigation into instances of officers' brutality, but where does that stand?
I can give you an updated figure. We were talking about 40 people killed about 3 weeks ago. Since then, that number has grown significantly. As we speak, we are now around 130 people killed, according to an organization called Plataforma de Cid. You asked me about investigations over the past years. That has been our main call as Human Rights Watch for security forces, for the Mozambican authorities to investigate, at least show interest in investigating. And then after investigating, charge formally those that are linked or implicated to the abuses and take them to a court where they can face fair trial and make sure that the victims get some sort of redress. Unfortunately, it is not a practice that the Mozambican authorities seem to like. I've been doing this job for 9 years now, and I don't remember ever the Mozambican authorities agreeing to investigate the abuses that organizations like ours or Amnesty or local groups have exposed, which somehow makes us to think at times that the violent repression against peaceful protests, the human rights abuses that we see security forces committing when they're doing their job with impunity, by the way, are somehow sponsored by those in power because it is convenient to them when security forces brutally go against those people that decide to come out openly against the government.
And try to change the status quo. So you've laid out a very vivid picture of why these protests are ongoing and why people are so angry. I want to talk about the main players in the election and moving forward. So we've mentioned the name of Venancio Mondlane. Venancio is a newcomer to Mozambican politics. He's an independent and the candidate who has claimed victory.
Bônus, 30 anos a viver por cima da fraude.
He is a pastor and a radio host who's been giving Facebook Lives from abroad ever since fleeing this government crackdown on protests after the election. What more can you tell me about him?
I can tell you that this year is the first time that he ran for president. I think he initially had hoped that he was going to run for president as part of the Renamo, which used to be the main opposition party in the country. But internal politics of the party pushed him out. And surprisingly, outside the big machinery that Renamo is, he was able to recreate himself, bring other groups to rally behind him, have essential and crucial members of the Renamo party joining him. And in October, we saw what we saw. Of course, results are still being disputed. But the fact that this guy came out now as the second most voted candidate for presidency, and the party that supported him is now officially the main opposition party of the country, having dethroned such a big party as Renamo, it shows itself the level of popularity that Venancio has. Now, having said that, he also is able to draw a lot of sympathy from the younger generation that does not identify anymore with the ruling party. Some of them never did. It's a younger generation that is largely marginalized, suffering the consequences of bad social and economic policies of the ruling party, who has been in power for almost 4 decades. It's a young generation that lacks almost everything, from a proper education to skills to get a job and support from the state to start their own businesses. So many of them are people who are so frustrated that they have nothing to lose. We saw this end of the year during graduations at universities, how most of the graduations had young people shouting Venancio's name during the ceremony.
Wow.
But he has also encompassed a large part of the middle upper class as well. a group of people who, because they did not feel safe going to the streets to protest, due to the way security forces responded to those protests, they then decided, for example, to stay in their houses and in their balconies, beating pots and pans for almost an hour.
So discontent from several different sections of the population.
Yeah. And I think for many years, Mozambicans have been watching that silently, appear to be in agreement. But in these elections, they have finally found a voice to say that enough is enough. If Renamo doesn't want to play the role of opposition, then move out and allow other party to do that job.
More with Zenaida after the break. Well, Zenaida, I hear you saying that some people have said enough is enough. And yet, according to the National Election Commission, the other candidate in this disputed election is Daniel Chapo. And Chapo won with 70.67% of the national vote, according to this body, followed by Mondlane, who got about 20% of the vote. So talk to me about Daniel Chapo. He was declared the winner of the October 9th election. He's a former TV presenter and a lawyer and a member of the Frelimo party, the party that has ruled Mozambique since independence in 1975. What else should we know?
When Frelimo, the ruling party, went for their internal elections to choose their candidate, Chapo was probably the less likely figure to be elected the party candidate. But thanks to a strong movement within the party, largely, by the way, largely composed by the younger generation of the party, he got the ticket.
A new generation that didn't fight in the war for independence. So that's new for Mozambican politics.
Completely new. These are two men who have witnessed another part of Mozambique. Both of them don't come from elite families or families connected to power. They are young men who went to the universities, struggled to find their job like everybody else, worked for several years, as civil servants, and then they became politicians. Now, why has Venancio them gathered such a huge support from the youth? My own theory is that it doesn't necessarily mean that people don't like Chapo. His own image ended up being hindered by the fact that he is associated to a ruling party that has been in power for 40 years and has not delivered what many people had expected them to deliver. Venancio, on the other hand, says what people want to hear.
Wow. Well, that brings me to my next question. Zenaida, you recently posted on social media a picture of a statue being taken down by protesters. The statue was of Alberto Chipande, a leading member of the Frelimo party, Daniel Chapo's party. He's credited with firing the first shot leading to Mozambique's liberation from Portugal's colonial rule. It seems clear that Frelimo is on tender footing for some of the reasons you just mentioned. But what's happened over this past almost half century that's led Mozambique to where it is right now, that there is such strong discontent?
Look, the people that went to remove the statue of Chipande are of this generation that knows very little about liberation war. Of course, everybody knows Chipande in this country. He's a national figure, he's a national hero. If you went to school in Mozambique, it's on your history book. You study him, you learn about him. But there is another element about him, is that he is also one of the richest people in this country. He owns mines. He is a wealthy man. He is often connected to wealth. He is part of the privileged few people that have everything, while the large majority has nothing. So it's quite difficult within that scenario for people to look at him and remember him as a national hero who once fought against a system that allowed few people to benefit from resources, and while the large part of the population struggled to make ends. I think the fact that people removed the statue from there was, one can interpret it as a way of saying that you have become what you fought against 40 years ago. So now it's our turn, let's say, to fight against you.
Well, you mentioned that he owned mines and was doing better than a majority of the country. 65% of the country of Mozambique live below the poverty line, but the nation is rich in natural gas, oil, coal, precious metals. Just a few years ago, Tesla began sourcing graphite from Mozambique for the batteries for its cars. And now protesters may be targeting some of those mines and the mining industry. Why?
Because their leader told them to. That's the easiest answer to you.
So this doesn't come from a more innate feeling of the haves and the have-nots, and that this is an industry that's taking from our country?
It might be, but I think it's important to go back to that point where I said Mozambicans this time found finally a way of expressing themselves. Protests against mines have always happened, by the way, but silently, away from the spotlight and the cameras. No, I mean, once in a while they can be reported by this or that media. Often, very often, those protests are violently repressed by security forces. Why? Because the partners in those mines that are largely known as multinationals, then who are their local partners? Are people linked to the ruling party. So they have the power to call the police chief and say, communities are harassing the workers of my mine. We have reported that. We have documented it in the past. Our partners have done so. So I think what Mondiane has done is to tell people that you now have the license, official license. I'm giving you the license to go out there and boycott those multinationals or big companies that have been exploring resources in your regions. And of course, we can give several names of companies that have suffered with recent protests. One of them is the one you mentioned, Syria, the graphite mine in Balama. The later ones have even declared force majeure.
And force majeure basically meaning, in other words, they're going to stop supplying Tesla.
And now recently, the leader of the protests has announced that the next stage of protests will, apart from other things, target specifically mines.
So that brings me to my final question. We mentioned at the start of this conversation that this is a story of protest that is months in the making, but it's very likely that things are only going to heat up from here. Next week, the Constitutional Council is expected to validate the election results, and Mondlane has announced he will be taking power in January. So I wonder where that leaves us. Do these protests have the potential to bring the change that people are demanding? What would it take to get there? Or is this just, as you've said, about expressing themselves and finally having that avenue to express themselves?
It's about all of that. People are getting to express themselves, which is a right they have. It's about exposing the police brutality. I think we have never seen in the Mozambican history so many abused by security forces recorded on camera. We have had cases of people being killed while doing live streaming. We have had a case of a military vehicle running over a woman who was just sitting on the middle of the road peacefully protesting. We have had cases on camera of security forces firing at residential areas indiscriminately. We have had cases of security forces firing at people who have kneeled down, raised their hands in the sign of I surrender. As Human Rights Watch, we are not calling for election results to be changed. But I think that Mozambicans have finally found what we usually say the pin to express their grievances without fear. Then we can discuss scenarios. Let's imagine the results are changed and the victory is given to Mondlane. You should know that he has made several promises, some of them very difficult to deliver. And these same young people that puts him in place as president can easily remove him from there if he doesn't deliver. If the Election Commission confirms Chapo as the elected president, then Chapo will have to learn to be more forthcoming and more available to engage with the young people and listen to what they want, so that he himself doesn't end up being removed because this large part of the society and voters does not identify with him.
And that's The Take. What other stories are you following on the continent of Africa? And what would you like to see us cover there? We're listening and looking for what you have to say. Jot down a comment below and we'll check it out. We'll be back tomorrow.